focus of the night the issue of responsible science activism in a moment. But this is also rather a special event in the history of the Foundation for Science and Technology, because it is the final event which will have been organised and planned by our excellent director, Gavin Costigan. Gavin has been working for us for 7 years. So we reckon that makes about 70 of these conferences. And Gavin has also contributed to the work of the Foundation for Science and Technology in many other ways. He has created and developed our Future Leaders program, which is really an extra contribution that we now make with 30 to 40 mid-career scientists and people working in public policy with a science background, trying to crack the mysteries of how science and policy interact. Some of us have been trying to understand them for even longer than that, and just occasionally there's a moment when it briefly makes sense. So Gavin has really made a fantastic contribution. Before he arrived at the Foundation for Science and Technology, he had a distinguished career in the civil service, working in the business department, and also working in the Foreign Office, leading the Science and Innovation Network, or SIN. He was indeed head of SIN in the Foreign Office, a responsibility which is now widely shared. But so Gavin, I think, still epitomizes for me the great strengths of the British civil service: extreme competence, unflamboyant efficiency, and he also has a very wide and deep understanding of the science and tech community. So we're always able, assisted by fantastic advice from our council, to identify the key speakers who would really ensure that at an FST event you got to the heart of the issue and had open and frank events. Indeed, I have to say that the continuing character and quality of FST events owes a lot to Gavin. So we have to say farewell to Gavin this evening. We also should welcome his successor, Alex Rees, who was selected after we had a wide range of applicants applying for the post. And I hope that you will also give a warm welcome to Alex. And we very much look forward to Alex's contribution to the FST in the future. We now have created an FST ritual, which you are about to see conducted for perhaps the first time, which is the official handing over of the FST bell. So, Gavin, I'd like to invite you to say us to give us a few words, and then to conclude with this important ceremony, which will now become part of the deep history of the FST. But Gavin, can I personally thank you for everything you have done, particularly to assist me in my responsibilities as chairman. It has been fantastic, and you have made a wonderful contribution, and I personally am very grateful to you for everything you've done.
Well, thank you very much, David. I can tell you it's a lot more comfortable to be sat down there than to be up here. It is slightly worrying to see all of you, but it's lovely to be here. It's been a huge pleasure to run the Foundation for Science and Technology over the last 7 years, and it's been a huge time of change. I mean, if you think back to 2019, that was that dark and distant time before we'd had COVID. No one had heard of Zoom. All our events were in person only. In fact, in March 2020, we were due to have an event on this strange virus called coronavirus, but it was cancelled because of coronavirus. And on the evening that it was due to happen, I couldn't have been here anyway because I was sick in bed with coronavirus. So we had to reinvent things. We learned how to run webinars. And when we returned to in-person, we actually then live streamed all our events, and that's allowed us to have a much wider range of people following from all around the world, in fact. And it turns out that that gives us a recording, and one of our biggest audiences is our Netflix dial in and watch the video afterwards audience. And those videos live on our website sort of permanently. So anyone who's loved an event, do come and watch it again and again. It's there for you. And the great thing about these type of events is the ability to hear from and question and sometimes challenge different views from a huge range of speakers. And sometimes we have a panel and they're in violent agreement, and sometimes, just a warning, today might be such an occasion when there's a disagreement across the panel. But it's always sort of a constructive dialogue, and I love it. It's absolutely true. But when I started, these events were the thing we did, and they were brilliant. But we now have a second equally important activity, which, as David has referred to, and probably the one I'm most proud of, which is the Foundation Future Leaders Scheme. And this is our contribution of helping the next generation of professionals from the civil and public sector, from industry, from research, across the science ecosystem in the UK, to build their own links and contacts and talk firsthand to senior leaders across the sector. And if anyone was on that first cohort, and there may be one or two in the room, one or two watching online, you'll know that that first year we made it up as we went along. We had zero budget, but loads of enthusiasm, and even a COVID pandemic couldn't get in our way. But the fact that it's grown in popularity every year, and the fact that we're now running our 7th cohort is just astonishing. And to anyone who's been on the scheme, I say, do keep in touch with the foundation. You are the people we want at these events. Keep coming, because future leaders are eventually leaders, and that's fantastic. But the other reason I've been so lucky working here is the people I've worked with. All the things we do, the events, the roundtables, the Future Leader Scheme, the journals, the podcasts, it's all a team effort, and it's all a really small team. So for those who don't know, the FST runs with a staff of 4, not all of whom work full-time. So it's always busy, it's always juggling activities. But I'd like to say an enormous thank you to Angela, to Charlotte, to Laurie, to Simon Napper, who's somewhere in the audience, and to Keith Laurie, who should be in the audience and may or may not be here. I couldn't have done this, we couldn't have done this without being in the team. So thank you to all of you. That's absolutely brilliant. But now the formal part of the evening. As you said, my predecessor handed me this bell and told me this is one of the most useful things in the running of these events. And if you've been to the events over 7 years, you will know I've rung this bell in your face several times, and it is a good way to get people to come in here and go downstairs. So I would formally like to hand this over now to Dr. Alex Rees.
Thank you very much, Gavin, for a final time. That's very hard to say. I add my voice to what a wonderful job Gavin has done over the last 7 years or so. And I would like to re-emphasise what he says about the Future Leaders Programme in particular. I've had the pleasure of speaking on that programme a number of times, and it's been great to see. And I recognise some of the faces in the room who've been on that programme, and it genuinely makes a difference. And that's, for me, very important. And that's very much Gavin's vision to kind of push that forward. So we will miss you, but undoubtedly Alex will pick up the mantle. So for those who don't know me, I'm Professor Paul Monks, a former Chief Scientific Advisor for the Department of Energy Security and Net Zero, and a professor at the University of Leicester. And it's my honour to chair you this evening. You might think, why do I not look like David Willits? Well, there's a number of answers to that question. But the simplest is that he has to go and do something more important, so you're left with me tonight as part of that. So welcome to this event, which has been hosted by the Foundation for Science and Technology. Welcome for those of you joining us at the Royal Society this evening, and welcome to you all joining us also online. As you've already heard, the title for today's event is From Publication to Public Action, the Case for Responsible Science Activism. What we're building on here is absolutely that the scientific evidence for climate change, the harm it is currently causing and will cause in the near future, and the actions needed globally to avoid catastrophic levels of warming are firmly established. So we're not going to debate really the climate science tonight. We're going to take that absolutely as a given. But in 2020, more than 11,000 scientists globally published a warning of climate emergency. That letter began, "Scientists have a moral obligation to clearly warn humanity of any catastrophic threat and to tell it like it is. On the basis of this obligation, we declare, with more than 11,000 scientist signatories from around the world, clearly and unequivocally that the planet Earth is facing a climate emergency. There's a huge amount of work that takes place at that science-policy interface, but scientists across the globe argue that policy action is not happening at anything like the scale that is required. So today, we're going to be asking whether scientists could and should lobby for change beyond providing scientific evidence, bringing both the expertise and their passion rather than retaining a professional detachment and feeding into the science advisory process. So we're going to explore the question, is there a case for responsible scientific activism where scientists speak out to affirm the reality, gravity and urgency of the multiple challenges that we face? And if there is, how should the science community, universities and other employees and the science structures in government respond to that challenge? And I asked my wife on the way to the station this morning what she thought, and luckily I caught my train. So I already know that we're in for a fulsome evening of debate on this sort of topic. So we're going to hear from a wonderful set of four speakers with 4 short presentations, and then we'll have a panel for those of you following online. Can I ask if you are following online that you go to Slido and put your questions on there. We'll be monitoring on those, and I'll try to be my David, and coagulate those questions into some sort of coherent form. We can do that at any time. You don't need to wait for the Q&A to start. So without further ado, let me introduce our first speaker, Dr. Charles Gardner. Now, unfortunately, Charles has come down with an illness, but he actually has risen from his bed to actually give us a short video on this. So we're actually going to have a video from him. For those of you who don't know, Dr. Charlie Gardner is a conservation scientist turned activist and writer, an associate senior lecturer at the Durrell Institute of Conservation and Ecology at the University of Kent. I'm not going to make any comment on that. He spent most of the 2 decades working to conserve tropical biodiversity before shifting to climate change. He left academia to focus on driving society towards social tipping points as a climate communicator, writer, and activist, and is a member of Scientists for Extinction Rebellion. Charlie, over to you, hopefully with a video that will now play. Thank you.
Good evening, and thanks for your understanding in allowing me to join you this evening by video. It would have been such an honour to speak at the Royal Society, and I'm really sorry to be missing the event. I'm Charlie Gardner, and ever since I was a young child, all I've wanted to do was help conserve nature. So I became a conservation scientist. Like medicine, public health, and countless other fields, conservation science is a mission-driven discipline. We don't carry out research purely because we delight in knowledge and understanding, but because we hope that our knowledge will be used by decision makers and others across society to make the world a better place. We do it, in other words, because we believe our research findings will lead to positive change. But I've been increasingly frustrated and disillusioned through my career in conservation, because while we were compiling an ever more impressive and irrefutable body of knowledge that both demonstrated the need for conserving biodiversity and showed how it could be done, it hasn't been leading to change. The natural world continues to be destroyed, and economic policies the world over continue to favour the destruction of the living world over its conservation. Exactly the same has been happening with climate change. We've known about the threat for a long time, and the number of research publications addressing the causes, impacts, and threats of climate change has soared, alongside research on how society should respond. Yet they've done little to stimulate the policy changes that are so urgently required. Despite decades of ever more strident scientific warnings, no country on Earth has a plan to phase out fossil fuels, and the volume of anthropogenic emissions continues to grow year on year. The science is very clear that we need to be slamming on the brakes of global emissions, yet the foot is still firmly on the accelerator. Something is clearly very wrong in the way society has responded to scientific warnings. In 2019, I heard about Extinction Rebellion on the news and headed to London to join their international rebellion. It was one of the largest acts of civil disobedience in modern British history, and it shut down 5 parts of London for days on end. And it was immensely effective. Within 2 weeks, Parliament declared a climate and environment emergency, and the protests were found to be extremely influential in Theresa May's government becoming the first OECD country to set a legally binding decarbonisation target. They also generated extraordinary levels of media coverage of the climate and nature crises, leading to a televised climate debate between party leaders ahead of the 2019 general election. The protests and resultant press coverage, in turn, pushed levels of public concern to unprecedented levels. And in 2020, climate and the environment became the top concern for British voters. In just a few weeks, a few thousand people had catalyzed a sense of urgency that the global scientific community had failed to bring about through decades of warnings. Decision makers had found the scientific warnings easy to ignore, but here were people who had listened to the science, been stirred into action, and made themselves impossible to ignore. As part of it, I felt powerful and influential for the first time in my career, and it led me to rethink how best I could bring about change as a scientist. In my career, I had a very simplistic, even naive view of how research influenced policy. I felt that if the scientific community generated information and provided it to decision makers, those decision makers would use that information to make wise decisions in the public interest. I also believed that if we communicated our findings to the public, then people would pressure decision makers into making wise, evidence-based decisions. But after becoming an activist and more closely investigating just why society has been so slow to take action on climate and nature, I've come to see policy making very differently. For scientists aren't the only interests seeking to influence governments. Looking at climate change, it's easy to see why we fail to take the action that science shows we need. For serious action on climate requires ending the use of fossil fuels, and the fossil fuel industry has invested very heavily indeed to stop that from happening. Most obviously, it's done so through political donations and lobbying. There are no running totals, but this table shows the lobbying spend of 5 destructive industries in just one country in just 1 year. Collectively, these and similarly destructive industries, like plastics and construction and motoring and mining, have spent hundreds of billions of pounds in circumventing the democratic process to avoid being regulated out of existence. Where the scientific community seeks to influence decision makers with graphs and data, those opposed to evidence-based policies have done so with vast piles of money, and they've been hugely successful in shaping policy environments in their favor. Such industries have also shaped policy more indirectly by manipulating public perceptions of scientific issues. This includes the direct deception of the public through campaigns of scientific misinformation, such as the ongoing, decades-long campaign by the fossil fuel industry to obfuscate the causes of climate change. This campaign has sought to create doubts in the public mind about established scientific realities, and it's done so, at least in part, by sowing distrust in the scientific process, scientific institutions, and scientists themselves. More recently, the campaigns shifted from outright science denial to more sophisticated narratives aimed at nurturing doubts about the need for urgent decarbonisation. And similar tactics have been adopted by other industries. As shocking as it is to consider, many of the world's most destructive industries actively invest in muddying public understanding of key scientific issues. As the history of our global response to climate change shows, policymaking is not the information deficit problem I once thought it was. Rather, It is a contested space, a battle for power and influence between those who advocate for evidence-based policies and the special interests who lobby to prevent the adoption of the very legislation that science suggests is necessary in order to maintain and eke out the highly profitable status quo. And these vested interests have been consistently very successful in shaping policy in their favor through their enormous financial, political, and narrative shaping power. In this context, I've come to believe that the best way for scientists to push for evidence policies may not be simply in generating more evidence, as vital as that is. Rather, it may lie in lending our weight to the social movements, building a counterpower to the narrative, to the power of corporate vested interests. Indeed, social movements are increasingly recognized by sociologists, as well as scientific bodies like the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, as essential for catalyzing the transformative society-wide changes we need. As the suffragettes, civil rights movement, and other social movements through history have done, the climate movement has built pressure for policy change by disrupting the day-to-day normalcy of the status quo and making what were previously peripheral issues impossible to ignore. It's done so through three main mechanisms. The first is disruption, and by blocking roads, occupying buildings, and otherwise getting in the way, activists can force decision makers' hands to make policy decisions by increasing the costs of continuing to do nothing. The second mechanism is the effect of activism on public concern. Activism gets the issues talked about on the news and in the papers, particularly when it's disruptive. And that media coverage leads directly to increased levels of public concern. To understand the third mechanism, we must turn to social psychology and recognize that we are social animals who look to each other for cues as to what to think and how to behave. When the fire alarm goes off, you don't immediately start to run. You look to other people to see how seriously they're treating it, and only if they are concerned do you begin to treat it seriously yourself. Activism's effective in raising concern because it's a persuasive and honest signal of the urgency of the issues. For why else would anyone willingly and voluntarily risk arrest if the issues weren't deadly serious? There are a number of reasons that the scientific community should, in an increasingly shared opinion, engage with and support the social movements who have done so much to change the conversations on climate and nature breakdown, as my colleagues and I have detailed in a range of recent publications. But to my mind, the most important reason is that society relies on the scientific community to inform it of danger. Yet in limiting our efforts to scientific papers and written collective warnings, we have failed to communicate the danger effectively. If I was to tell you now that I can smell smoke coming from downstairs and I worry my house might be on fire, but then was just to continue giving this talk, you of course wouldn't believe me. Yet that's precisely what the scientific community is doing by publishing our warnings and then simply getting back to work as if nothing was the matter. Actions speak louder than words, and the scientific community has both the power and the duty to act as if the truth that we have revealed is, after all, real. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Charlie, for doing that. I hope you are watching or get to watch this at some later date, and I do hope you get better from your illness. So moving on now, I'd like to introduce our second speaker. Our second speaker is Dr. Abby Perrin. Dr. Abby Perrin is a research scientist turned climate and nature communicator and activist. After more than a decade studying microbial life, she now aims to bring science out of academia into the spaces it most urgently needs to be understood and acted upon. She has written science-based training and workshops for a range of audiences, coordinating various campaigns and co-writing a book of personal stories from 25 scientists who have taken different forms of climate action. Abby also works to establish community-owned renewable energy projects, as well as stronger networks that facilitate action and change. Abby.
So, I've loved science for as long as I can remember. I've never loved standing up in front of a room of people and giving a talk. So, just bear with me a little bit, perhaps. But these pictures, I've shown them to try and capture two of the moments of absolute wonder that were part of my career in research science. The first is of a malaria parasite at the precise moment it attaches to a red blood cell, ready to invade it and cause all the horrible symptoms of that deadly disease. And the second is of cyanobacteria, and glowing in green are their carboxysomes, which are these incredible carbon dioxide concentrating compartments which allow them to fix carbon dioxide incredibly efficiently. That was an incredible thing to be able to see as a research scientist. To get to a point where I was involved in the taking of these pictures, I trod a very well-trodden path in academia. I thoroughly believed that research was the best way I could use science to make a positive impact in the world. But when I first began to understand and critically really feel the scale and urgency of the emergency we're facing, that trajectory in academia was disrupted. Learning the realities of the climate and ecological crises was frightening 8 years ago when I first really engaged with it. It still is. In fact, it gets more and more frightening every day. Back in 2018, I looked for every single bit of evidence I could find that there wasn't really an emergency, or that governments were listening to much more experienced scientists than me, and that it was all basically in hand. I really, really wanted to believe that my own life wouldn't be profoundly affected. But the more I tried to convince myself of this, the more I tried to find evidence that things would be okay, or pretty much okay, the more I understood that things were much, much worse than I had ever imagined. And to echo a little bit of what Charlie said, and in the words of the UN Secretary General, we are on a highway to climate hell, and our foot is still on the accelerator. These were his words in 2023, but that's perhaps more true now than it was then. And it would be bad enough if it was just climate that we had to tackle. It's much bigger than this. Climate is just one of at least 7 of our planet's safe limits that we are operating far beyond. This was known in the global scientific community for a long time, and it certainly was known in 2018. But my experience being a research scientist in that environment would never have told me that. Nothing around me was really changing. In the lab, we were conducting our experiments, planning long-term research programs, as if the world was going to stay roughly the same for decades, if not much longer to come. It didn't make sense anymore, holding those two dual realities, and I didn't know what to do. I've never seen myself as someone who breaks rules or acts in any way, in any kind of extreme way. And when climate protests arrived on the streets of London, where I was living at the time, back in 2019, it was with huge fear, massive trepidation, that I joined them. Finding a group of scientists within the environmental movement was truly transformative, though. I learned a huge amount of actual science in those spaces, really important things that the rest of my science education hadn't taught me, or barely even touched on. But perhaps even more importantly, I've learned how to be effective with that science by being a scientist activist. Charlie talked quite a bit about social movements, and I'm sure Jeff will expand on talking about protest and other things. But I don't think any of us in this science activism space consider it just to be about visible or disruptive or even particularly provocative forms of action only. There are a plethora of ways that scientists can support social movements to be effective. And that could be through researching different strategies, that could be helping activists to communicate science accurately and effectively and confidently. It can be contributing an expert testimony to a public hearing, for instance. And there are many, many more ways of engaging in activism that we can talk about for the rest of this discussion. Scientist-led activism doesn't have to involve social movements at all, although there are lots of reasons why social movements can be incredibly effective vehicles for it. Our workplaces and institutions, as well as every community that we're a part of, need to transform rapidly to be able to weather the storms that are literally coming our way and fast. The action that happens in wider society shouldn't just be dictated by scientists. I'm not saying that at all. But science and evidence are vital to informing and underpinning effective action. Scientists have so much we can contribute as part of that, in bringing science into society. All of these different forms of action are important, and they're all interdependent. We can't really have one without the other. And there's no hierarchy. To enable the kind of change we need to protect ourselves, others, and the world around us, the world we love to study, we need to work together, all of us using our skills, positions, and connections in the ways that we can most be effective. So I'm not here to tell you that you need to take any one course of action. To try and illustrate that, I've just highlighted a few examples of what this has looked like for me over the past couple of years. Drawing on exactly the same skills I used in reviewing literature and summarizing it for scientific grants and papers, I've taken all the environmental science I learned as part of the climate movement to contribute to writing workshops and trainings for a huge range of different audiences and initiatives. And back in my own community in York, I've been using the exact technical and analytical knowledge I gained from all my scientific training to channel that into community energy. It's a huge challenge to establish these kind of locally generated renewable energy systems, and the movement needs scientists to make it work. As an early career researcher, I also threw myself into sustainability groups and organizing in my workplaces. But from the inside of those institutions, I found huge inertia, often active resistance to changing priorities and practices. Almost all of my colleagues, and especially my students, were worried about the emergency that was unfolding, and still is. Most expressed a strong desire to do more, to be part of changing things, but didn't know where to start perhaps, or didn't believe that they could be effective if they tried. Most also believed they wouldn't be supported in their efforts to do so within the institutions. And almost all felt already quite overloaded. This is a real systemic problem in UK science and academia. Social science, like the paper I've just put up here, shows that this experience, my own anecdotal experience, is far from unusual. I found myself quite vulnerable in my workplaces, even when I made quite gentle efforts to engage leadership with these issues. Anything on initiatives to facilitate more climate, nature, or sustainability education for staff and students, or anything that went beyond changing light bulbs or recycling in our institutions was basically off the table to talk about in some situations. And perhaps thorniest of all, I found myself particularly vulnerable when I asked questions or gently challenged the relationships that we had with some of the most highly polluting industries in the world within the academic space. Some of those industries are directly contributing to the problems that our work was attempting to solve. I was regularly told that enough was already being done, that other things were more important, or that changing things within those institutions was simply not possible. I still believe universities, research institutions, and learned societies have huge potential to be part of accelerating vital transitions in society through the knowledge they generate, through the learning they facilitate, and the resources they can provide to wider communities. But ultimately, I left academia with an extremely heavy heart, feeling that I'd largely failed to play a meaningful role in any of that happening where I was. And my experience is not unique. But it doesn't have to be this way. Activism and academia need not be in conflict. I've seen many ways that, in fact, they complement one another. I've learned so much through different forms of activism that's made me a better scientist. I have a more holistic understanding of the context that my own work has existed within, and I have much wider networks providing me with support and insights from across so many disciplines. I also see science activism as something that enables science and scientists to be genuinely impactful, both through public and political engagement, but also through challenging and empowering the scientists who participate. 8 years ago, when I started this journey, if you like, I felt extremely powerless. I felt completely resigned to my role as a scientist, being to describe a dying world in increasingly excruciating detail, until a point where that was no longer going to be possible. Scientist activist communities, including Charlie, Jeff, and hundreds of others around the globe, if not more, have made it clear to me how urgent it is that scientists stand up. We act with courage, we act with creativity, and we act with care in response to this terrifying and escalating emergency that we face. But perhaps more importantly, they've also shown me how effective we can be when we do that.
Thank you, Abby, for that. Our third speaker is Professor Jeff Wodge. Jeff Wodge is a part-time agricultural ecologist at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, where he was formerly the director of the Leverhulme Centre for Integrative Research in Agriculture and Health, and of the London International Development Centre. He now spends much of his time supporting community-led nature restoration projects in North London and is a member of Scientists for Extinction Rebellion. He has worked in the science advisory roles internationally and on advisory committees for DEFRA, Natural England, DFID, and RCUK in the UK. Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you, Paul, and good evening, everyone. As Paul pointed out, I'm an ecologist by training. You might note that we've sort of selected opposite extremes of the academic lifestyle, our life stages between Abby and me. I'm an ecologist now facing a new career in conservation after what we call retirement. After 50 years working in agriculture, environmental, and more recently public health sectors. And during my career, after an initial decade of focusing on research, I found myself increasingly involved in designing research programs and running departments and research institutions, nationally and internationally through a long period with the British Commonwealth. And in that science management role, I found myself particularly frequently drawn into providing scientific evidence for policy making. For instance, in a program to reduce the unnecessary use of pesticides in tropical countries, I found that helping ministries to ban demonstrably dangerous chemicals was a real challenge, a challenge more than that created by providing appropriate scientific evidence, particularly because of the local influence of international agrochemical companies. I learned that effective stewardship of scientific evidence into tangible policy change for the benefit of communities requires that scientists become savvy and good communicators. And in the last 20 years of my career at the University of London, I found myself in various scientist advisory roles. Paul's alluded to various departments. And that process I learned about and learned a lot about. It's a process that works. It's a process that is very slow, moving from committees to policymakers to policy action. But it is effective. It takes a long time, understandably subject to competing policy issues, understandably subject to political change and the change of governments and ministers, and susceptible, as Charlie has pointed out, to outside lobbying and influence. It was during that time, about 10, 15 years ago, that I had a Damascene moment. I was participating in a Rockefeller brainstorm on the future of environmental research at their Bellagio Conference Center when our group woke up one mid-workshop morning to the news that Donald Trump had been elected President of the United States, which was his first presidency. We stopped the workshop and redirected it towards the question of how to promote scientific evidence in a hostile political environment. And by the end of that meeting, we'd all agreed on the need to broaden our scientific engagement beyond just advising governments, but to embrace instead broader social and societal opportunities to communicate important scientific evidence to the public. And following this experience, I witnessed, as Charlie did, the way in which social movements like Extinction Rebellion were successfully bringing environmental issues into a very public space. And I came to the view that the climate and ecological emergency needed more such a public engagement to challenge the reluctance of governments to address this issue with the urgency that it required. The problem was immense and complex, the need for science-based policy change too urgent to rely on the action of simply advisory committees to governments and policy making in that way. So I joined the scientist group that supported Extinction Rebellion movement. The role of my fellow scientists and I played here was to help interpret the science for public action campaigns, to keep it precise, to keep it accurate, to keep it off the hyperbole that so easily wanders into, and to bring in other scientists into the movement and to address issues of particular relevance to science. So for instance, to give you a few examples of the kinds of things that we've been talking about, we challenged the sponsorship of our National Science Museum by fossil fuel industries. We believe that these companies were greenwashing their reputation and misleading young scientists and the public about their true commitment to scientifically sound energy futures. I think recent history has shown that to be true. Over a couple of years, we engaged and debated with Science Museum trustees and director. We conducted public-facing actions outside and inside the museum. We encouraged leading researchers and teaching organizations to publicly challenge the museum's policy in the media. Some museum policy was changed. Some fossil fuel sponsorships were ended, and the challenge still continues. And I'm not saying that science activism brought all this about. Success has many parents, but I'm confident it made a critical contribution. The picture of me over there comes from efforts to address the ecological emergency, some of the big pictures you saw with those posters, No Nature, No Future, over the last few years. Our scientist group helped in the organization and execution of 2 public actions in 2023 and 2024, which each brought over 60,000 concerned citizens to this Capitol to ask for action on nature restoration. Scientists played a major role in these, in particular by engaging and encouraging the big UK nature NGOs like RSPB, National Trust, Wildlife Trust to come off the fence and onto the streets. And they did. And they continued to do that. In these events, the presence of scientists symbolically in white lab coats, rather uncomfortable for some of us, particularly the psychologists, was requested by the public we were working with, and much appreciated. Participants told us that it made them feel more confident and creditable to have us there supporting them. Now, let me stress that I do not feel that scientists should abandon our historical role of providing scientific evidence to advice to committees and policymakers in government. Not at all. I'm only arguing that given the urgency of addressing climate change, and given the enormous effort being made now to suppress and distort the scientific evidence in this area, scientists need to consider doing more to bring science into a more public arena to achieve the objectives that nations and the private sector set themselves in the Paris Accord in 2015, which are clearly not being progressed. Now, as a scientist who's near the end of his formal career, I feel I have a particular obligation and a particular opportunity to do this. An obligation because the climate and ecological emergency happened on my watch. I failed to recognize and act on it in a timely manner, with all the taxpayer money that had been spent on educating me as a scientist. So it's about time maybe I did something. And importantly, it's an opportunity, because as a fairly senior scientist, I have a certain status in the scientific community and with governments and with the public, and I should use this to reach more people. And importantly, I have nothing to lose by being an activist, unlike my many young scientist colleagues like Abby, who put their careers at risk when they do so. And as an academic, I'm deeply concerned to see my young scientist colleagues being discouraged rather than supported for exercising public responsibility in this manner. So I conclude my presentation with 3 asks of the scientific community from the 3 of us here. We ask for a change in scientific institutions to create space and support for scientists to bring science to the public. Not just tolerance of activism in this kind of engagement, but support. Now, most universities now expect their staff that they make social contributions as a rewarded part of their career. In my university, this is called citizenship, and it covers such things as sitting on committees, working with ministries, and so on. I think supporting public action in climate change as scientists should be accepted as that kind of citizenship. Learned societies like this one should be considering and discussing the role of scientists in activism. I'm pleased to see that recently the British Ecological Society has just set up a process of that kind. Our second ask is that more scientists get active in public efforts to accelerate action on climate change and nature restoration. We are hundreds. We need to be thousands. Being a scientist activist can range from writing letters to the media to visiting MPs, running workshops and public protest and demonstration. There's so many ways to contribute. You've heard about that from both Charlie and Abby. And finally, we ask that science activism is accepted by the scientific community, by all of you, as a vital part of our toolkit for influencing policy and engaging publics in these exceptional times. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. And can I encourage people online to put any questions on Slido? That is not actually the right number that is on there, which is not going to help around that. The right number is 186-7733. 186-7733. So moving on now to our 4th speaker for tonight. I'm going to introduce Professor Sir Mark Walport. Sir Mark Walport is the Foreign Secretary and Vice President of the Royal Society. He was previously the Chief Executive of UKRI, and before that, the Government Chief Scientific Advisor and the Head of the Government Office for Science. He has many previous career highlights that include Trust and latterly Chair of the Kennedy Memorial Trust, Member and latterly Co-Chair of the Prime Minister's Council for Science and Technology, Director of the Wellcome Trust, Professor and the Head of Division of Medicine at Imperial College, London. And that number again is 186-7733, not that number there. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed. So I think it's fair to say that the first 3 speakers have been in violent agreement with each other. Indeed, their slides, they've all been on the same demonstrations. So my job is to provide a bit of challenge, I think. And so I want to start, I actually want to start by saying something about Gavin, because it is his last meeting, and I'm the last speaker at his last meeting. And one thing I would observe is I have spoken many times at these meetings before, and this is a much more diverse audience
in very many respects, particularly one in which it's impossible, you're not really allowed to say it, but it is a younger audience, and that is a good thing. Although I don't do much good to the average age, but never mind. So thank you, Gavin. So I want to start by asking the question, what do we actually mean by responsible science activism? And it's the juxtaposition of these three words that I think is where I want to challenge. So let's start with activism, because I think this is at the core of this evening's discussion. So I quite like the definition which came from the website of the Civil Liberties Union for Europe. Activism refers to action taken challenging those in power to bring about change in society and benefit the greater good. Now, it's quite hard to argue with that, and actually I don't argue with it. I think it's important. And most of those who label themselves activists would say that their tools start with campaigning and political activism. Again, that is a good thing. And one thing I would say is that I think if more scientists actually got engaged in the act of policy making by becoming politicians, that would be a very good thing. And history shows that actually scientists rather despise other scientists who go into politics, but that is the way you actually get change. But from campaigning and political activism, it moves to protesting through demonstrations, then civil disobedience, and in some cases more extreme behaviour that is well beyond the law. But my main beef with the title of this session is the juxtaposition of the words science and activism, because it presupposes that scientists have some special expertise as activists. And actually, I believe this is fundamentally wrong. And I was very struck by the white coats saying scientist, as though there's something superior about the knowledge of a scientist, some superior quality of being able to be an activist. And I would challenge that. Scientists are not exceptional human beings. They do know about science. Actually, what they don't know about really is policy making. So let us take the concrete example which everyone else has been talking about this evening, which is climate change. It was said at the beginning by Paul, and I agree. The evidence is so overwhelming that the current pace of climate change has anthropogenic causes. It's not really a subject of argument. There are very few politicians in this country who would disagree with that. That's the easy bit. Furthermore, I completely accept the need for urgent decarbonisation. But of course, there's a question about how urgent, and I'll come back to that in a minute. So the challenge is, what should be done to prevent or mitigate climate change, and mitigate, which immediately takes us to some of the most difficult policy choices that politicians have to make. And at the heart of this is something that has not been addressed so far in this evening's event, which is an intergenerational question. How do we balance investment in current versus future generations? And that is the great challenge for politicians and policymakers around the world. This is a time when current generations, particularly young people, are feeling the pinch around the world. And of course, we're lucky because we're in relatively rich countries, but many people are not. And they are also losing trust in democratic governments that don't appear to be working for large numbers of voters. And I should say that the premise of all the previous speakers is that science activism is successful. I'm afraid the evidence simply doesn't support it. The reality is that we are, if anything, moving backwards when it comes to policy action for dealing with climate change and indeed the other major environmental challenges that the planet faces. So the intergenerational equity question is one where none of the scientists here have mentioned it, and I don't think have any special expertise at all. There are two, if you like, extreme possible answers, which is that we could invest everything in the future, but that would have huge immediate cost implications, which would affect the lives of people living at the present. Or an alternative position, which I don't agree with, is we could simply ignore the future and say we don't care about future generations in order to tackle the major issues affecting present generations here and around the world. And there is some empirical evidence on this, actually, which is that if you ask people what their discount rate is for their grandchildren, they would say it's 0%. In other words, people can imagine their grandchildren. If you're older, you have grandchildren. Everyone cares about their grandchildren. But if you ask people what their discount rate for their grandchildren's grandchildren is, it's 100%. So we are very bad at humans about thinking about future generations. And that is a challenge. And I'm afraid there's plenty of evidence that policy decisions now are being taken that favour older rather than younger members of society, particularly in those countries with ageing demographics. So the voters vote against the interests of younger people because, of course, there are more older voters, and younger people tend to be disillusioned and not vote as much as they should. So the reality is that most policymakers don't come out with either one extreme or the other, but unfortunately most of the policy decisions are significantly nearer to caring for the present at the expense of the future. Now, I'm afraid science does not and cannot provide the answer to the intergenerational question. And the challenge I would make is that I think putting the juxtaposition of the words science and activism is wrong. Because it claims that scientists have some special locus. What about lawyers? What about school teachers? What about school children? Why don't they have badges saying school child or whatever? But for some reason we see these signs saying scientist. Now there is also another weakness of so-called science activism. Of course there's an imperative to move away from burning fossil fuels, but there is also, I'm sorry to say, an imperative to maintain the functioning of advanced, largely urbanized human environments. The heating systems in the UK are still very dominated by gas, for example. Transport is a long way from being decarbonized. So stopping the use of fossil fuels overnight would have pretty devastating effects on sophisticated urbanized societies. And activists, I think, tend to look at issues through a telescope with a rather narrow angle of view, if I can put it that way. I hope I'm wrong, but I think what is going on in and around the Strait of Hormuz may provide a stark illustration of the consequences of a severe sudden loss of global supply of fossil fuels. But I think there's something else, which is that we will all have seen the images of the tankers stuck on one side or other of the Strait of Hormuz. And they just show that in spite of all the claims about how effective science activism is, the reality is that there are vast amounts of fossil fuel being transported around the world, and the need for this means that the market price is going up dramatically at the moment. So I think the consequences for rich countries of what's going on will probably be mainly economic, but it won't be pretty. So, on the initial presentation, good policymakers do examine potential policies through a wide-angle lens. And there are three things that need to be looked at. People are always coming up with great ideas for policies, but often they are completely infeasible to deliver. So the first question policymakers ask is, are they feasible? They also, of course, do ask the question, what does the evidence show? In other words, what do I know about X or Y in order to make my policy decision? Policymakers look to see what the unintended consequences of policy decisions are. And the third and most important in many ways is whether electorates are likely to accept them or not. Now, none of these three lenses are the domains of expertise of scientists. And indeed, the rather rare scientist who does become a politician, they don't always succeed unless they're good at looking at all these three necessary domains of effective policy making. However, I think there's a second form of activism, which is to ensure that the evidence from rigorous science is properly fed into the processes for policy making nationally and internationally. And this is achieved, as Jeff has said, by the provision of accurate scientific advice to policymakers. That is the domain of science advisors to government. It's advice that is not delivered through a megaphone. It's advice that's delivered as part of the process of policy making, rather than after the policy is made, which is too late. And it is advice that's gathered from the best experts, wherever they are. And the role of science advisors is to act as a transmission mechanism between the outside world of science and the inside world of government. Science advice can also be provided in the public domain by effective communicators of science, and I have got no disagreement with any of the previous speakers about the importance of the public communication of science. Finally, I just want to turn to the question about what we mean by responsibility, responsible. And this is actually, funny enough, the hardest of the three words combined in this discussion to define, because what is considered responsible is often in the eye of the beholder. And I'll end by quoting from a blog entitled, What Does It Mean to Be Responsible?, which is on the British Academy website by Professor Ilan Barron of the University of Durham, which is a blog I think worth reading. And two quotes provide the gist of his argument. When we think of being responsible, responsibility tends to include a moral component, even if that morality changes based on context, person, time, and place. And responsibility emerges when we are faced with something not working as it should, when the meaningful structures of our societies begin to break down, and we're forced to confront more about ourselves and our world than we normally do. So in that context, I'm perfectly happy for scientists to be activists, but I do not accept that they are science activists. And to be really provocative, at a time when trust in science is threatened, I think this terminology is actually untrustworthy. And I just end by pointing out that whatever we think, electorates are electing populist governments around the world. And the idea that science activism is promoting science in trust in science, I'm afraid, is for the birds. So I would end by saying I think we need more scientists as politicians, because it is actually elected politicians that determine policies. Thank you very much.
Yes, please. Thank you. Great. Well, the favourite part of the meeting now, the discussion part of the meeting, and I think we've had an interesting spread of views, and I think we're here to kind of probably agree disagreeably. I think somebody else has got that already patented, but I'm not quite sure who yet. But I think kind of hear and pull apart some of the arguments that we've heard tonight and the diverse views that come with that, and think about what does really responsible science activism look like. Mark's argument is that some of that is incompatible with policy making, and we've heard arguments for what can be achieved through different versions of activism and science activism tonight. So I think I'm going to turn straight to the floor. If you are online, please do put your questions online. 1867733 is the right one. And if you please do upvote your favourite questions, I can come to that as part of the evening. So I'm going to go straight to the floor, and in the normal way, I'm going to try and get kind of 2 or 3 questions for the panel to digest at a given time. So who would like to start off? I'm not seeing any hands at all. Oh no, here we go. There we go. Super. Lady there first. Yeah. I just happen to be nearest the microphone, so.
Hi, I'm Hilary Levers. I'm CEO of Engineering UK, not necessarily speaking in that capacity. And that was a very powerful ending to the presentations, which I just, being fresh in my mind, would be great to pick up on. Actually, the position that activism doesn't increase the popularity of a particular position. And I'm not sure what evidence we have for that, and particularly going right back to the start of the presentations, where popular movements have often been galvanized or led by extreme activism, which then kind of can make the middle path a little bit more palatable, as it were. I would also fully support the premise that many more scientists and engineers should become politicians. Love to see that. But they are still then led by the need for the popular vote, and also, to return to that earlier point, about driven by their funders. So I'd be interested in how we can actually just have a response to that funding cycle as well.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
Lady in front on the right here in the blue top.
Hi, I'm Jane from the Institute of Physics and also one of the Foundation Future Leaders. So thank you very much for all of your presentations. I just wanted to understand a little bit more about both perspectives, because to me they seem quite complementary. If you could have scientists as politicians and activism raising it on the public agenda, I don't necessarily see them as opposite sides of the spectrum. It would be great to have scientists as politicians and then also public interest in an issue. Then the politicians are more likely to push through that policy. But perhaps that's just my limited understanding of how the political process works. So I guess, does it have to be opposites, or could it be part of a complementary spectrum of activism?
Super. And one more question, Jim.
Yeah, it's Jim Skene. I'm chair of IPCC, so I don't have a question. I just have opinions. So let me come out on that one. Just to say, I was particularly attracted by this topic because I spend a lot of my time, our elected scientific members of the IPCC Bureau sometimes go into activism mode and express their opinions in the media. And I have to spend an enormous amount of time explaining why that is not the consensus view that was reached by the IPCC governments. But the one observation I would make, the scientific community is not homogeneous. It's a kind of ecosystem in its own right. And some people occupy niches that may take them more towards activism, and some may take them more, like me, towards the more institutionalized aspects of science that are going to be a little bit slower. But the invitation I would have on the activist side is a bit of self-reflection to understand the difference between a scientist's opinion and a scientific truth. Because in my view, sometimes these things can be confused a little. And I can see it because we have 650 scientists from diverse countries. And there is an extraordinary correlation between the broad views that scientists express and the positions of their countries. So you get environmental activism in Europe, greater concern about poverty alleviation and development in other parts of the world. And so, the kind of things that come up, I'm just looking at the zero-order draft of the latest working group reports. And scientists love to pronounce about how their work is important in the context of the Paris Agreement. And 90% of the time, they interpret the Paris Agreement wrongly, and we need to correct them before it finally comes out. There are many scientists, especially from the developing world, who much more think about poverty alleviation, development, and the consequences of environmental action for that, rather than just the environmental side. And just a couple of really provocative ones to flag up here. We have a sister panel, the Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services panel. And in our view, they are much more policy prescriptive than IPCC is. And that's a very interesting phenomenon. It's partly the nature of the governments that come to it. And may I say that some of the strongest environmental activism actually comes from the physical science part of IPCC, rather than the parts that are more concerned with the social and economic side and the policy implementation. So I hope that's provoked a little. Opinions, are not a question there. But could I just say to Jeff there, as somebody, I'm roughly at the same career stage as you, I guess. And who knows, once I finish this conservative, boring IPCC job, I may have my Road of Damascus moment as well. So I offer you that encouragement.
Excellent. Right. So we've got a wide range of sort of kind of questions and comments there. Activism. Does activism really increase popularity and the funding links? Aren't they two sides of the same coin, was the argument? Aren't they just different perspectives? And we should take that into account. And Jim's asking for a little bit of self-reflection from the activist of opinion versus truth. And activism is a very, I think Jim is arguing that it depends on, very perspective-driven. Where you are drives the perspective of that. A little bit to Mark's earlier argument, there's not a single truth in this, if you will, around it. So I'll start, I am going to start on the left and move to the right. It's not to make Mark the last person every time, we will vary it. So Jeff, any thoughts on what you heard there, any sort of reflections?
Yes, a couple points that came up. One was one of the initial questions, I think, referred to whether activism makes scientists untrustworthy. It's a really interesting question. There is a growing body of research, but it's still very small. There have been no systematic reviews of it as yet. A recent paper by Laura Thomas Walters at Yale reviewed studies of whether activism has an impact on policy and on public opinion. It was just a review, but it did identify that there is a fair amount of evidence that activism does affect people's views, and that it does affect the way in which issues are represented more in the media. That doesn't necessarily lead to change. But it does indicate that, as Charlie pointed in some of his examples, that activism need not have no effect. But also, other studies indicate, for instance, that the trustworthiness of scientists is limited, and the effect of activism on the trustworthiness of scientists is limited. There are a number of studies there which are increasing. So I think that the science is out on it. There needs to be a lot more, but I'm not aware of any strong evidence that activism has no effect on public opinion, and nor that activism has no effect, has an effect of reducing the credibility of scientists. So I do agree with Jim that different scientists come to the issue of climate change from different perspectives. Having worked most of my life in tropical countries, I appreciate that issues there are very different from here. And that indeed, those scientists are advising governments who want advice in different topics. And so I suspect they come to the IPC and other organizations with their experience of working at that interface with their own governments, which might be more concerned about the effect of climate change on poverty and on food than the effect of climate change on the economy.
Super, let's keep moving. Abby.
I think the violent agreement in the room is that there is no one prescriptive way to engage, and there's lots of different forms of action, and all of them are important and valid. Where there seems to be this conflict is around this idea of credibility and trust in scientists. And I want to argue as strongly as I possibly can that aligning our actions and our words makes us more credible. If we, to use Charlie's analogy, if we say we're in the building is on fire and we don't leave, how can we expect trust in our message to be generated? So if we're saying publicly the scientific consensus is that there is an emergency, but we're just going to continue the way things are, then I think that's the biggest threat to our credibility that there can possibly be. We have to align our actions and our words. And the threat we face is so severe that I don't think there is such a thing as a disproportionate response to this. I think all forms of responses, we need all of them. Yeah, it's really hard to convey like how little I see the urgency in any of these spaces where I'm talking. We know that these threats are completely existential. It's quite jarring to hear things like about, there being a trade-off between current and future generations, when the action to protect current generations and future generations is exactly the same. We need to decarbonise as fast as we can, protect nature, and build different societal structures that enable humans to actually survive, let alone flourish. And that is incredibly urgent, and it's missing from almost any conversation I have in a scientific institution these days.
Mark, what about that challenge around urgency then?
So I want to pick up Hilary's point first, which is the problem is that it isn't a popular movement. It's very important, and I've got no disagreement about the science at all. But the reality is, if it was a popular movement, if there were lots of votes in it, then things would be happening. There aren't lots of votes in it, and the reality is that we're seeing populist governments elected. And to deal with sort of the point that Jeff made in response to Jim, activism is specific, it's not generic. And so there's going to be no universal answer as to whether activism is effective or not, because it depends about activism about what. And it's exactly the same when it comes to trustworthiness, and it's a point that Honora Neal has been making for many years. Trust is actually very context specific. And the area where science runs into trouble is when scientists are seen to be telling people how they should live their lives. And unless you can persuade people that people should be living, there's no point in pretending that doing everything now doesn't have consequences for people who are alive now. It does. Does it have important benefits for their children who are young and will experience much worse climate change than people of my generation? That's undoubtedly the case. But the reality is that unless you can persuade voters to vote in governments that will take greater action, then I'm afraid we're not going to make progress. And just look at the Straits of Hormuz and see how many tankers there are, see where they're going. And this is the real world in which we live. And so I just think this is making generic statements that activism is a good thing or a bad thing, or that science is trustworthy or not, don't make sense. You have to look at each one in its own context. So I recognize the priority. I think it's really important that scientists get the best advice. Sorry, that scientists give the best advice. That's Jim's job to a very large extent, and I largely agree with what you've said.
Okay, great. Let's continue to pull this apart. Well, let's go the back lady, the red top, black cardigan. I'll collect a few again. We'll come down to then sort of Charles and Ed. And keep on going. Yes, sorry.
That's okay. So I'm Rosalind Mist. I work at WWF. I used to work here at the Royal Society. And I don't actually know where to start. One of the things that we know from all the data that we look at is that scientists in scientific institutions are the most credible messengers on climate change. The other thing that we know is that people do care about climate change. They don't believe that other people care about climate change to the same extent. So if you could take those two things together and reflect on what you've said and what scientists' role should be, because activism has many, it's a range. There are different ways that you can be as a scientist, but there is something special about scientists, and there is definitely something around the public caring, but not believing that other people care. Doesn't mean it's a vote-winning issue, I understand that, but there is something there that I think would be interesting to explore.
Great, let's continue down there, down to Charles here.
Thank you. A great discussion. I'd like to ask the panel, is it worth thinking about the multiple roles that scientists have? And one is in providing policy-neutral advice on a subject, knowing that policy neutralness is an aspiration, something one can never achieve, but one's trying to summarize the evidence in a way that can be used with people with different worldviews and things. And that's one role a scientist has. And another role is exactly as being science activists. If one's an activist, one is inevitably involved in the political process. And so one is bringing in one's worldview, one's political view. And there's nothing wrong with that as a scientist, as long as one's clear that one is acting in this activist mode and not trying to claim one's being policy neutral and acting in this honest broker sense. And that the danger is that when one elides between the two, what Steve Rayner, the science philosopher, used to call crypto advocacy, one's appropriating the authority of science for a particular political view. That's where there's a danger, and that's where there's a loss of trust. So two very important roles that scientists play as activists and as honest brokers. And as long as one's very clear when one's attempting to be an honest broker and when one's attempting to be an activist, and as I said, bringing in not only one's science background, which is very valuable, but also one's political view.
Okay, lady with the grey top behind, and then gentleman at the front here, and I'll come back next round, if I may.
Thank you. I'm the CEO of the Linnean Society. We've got around 3,000 fellows worldwide, some of whom would call themselves activists, and some of whom wouldn't. In fact, I know they wouldn't. But my question's not about that. Actually, I wanted to say that I felt quite moved to hear you, Abby, talk about your wanting to kind of make changes within your institutions and being blocked at every angle. And I just wanted the panel to really comment on, I guess, anti-activism. So, you know, sometimes you have people in power in organisations, you know, the leaders, the directors, the CEOs, or heads of department who are scientists, who should be role models for maybe the early career scientists. And their behaviour actually influences the behaviour of the younger generation. And I just feel like, what should we do about the anti-activists, I guess? I'm just interested to know your...
Okay, that's an interesting perspective. Just chap in the front here, and then we'll go to the panel. I'll come back round to a couple of others' hands as well.
Thank you very much. David Cope from Cambridge University, although what I'm going to say is very much my own personal opinion. Haven't really heard much discussion about the agencies that are involved in this science activism. And I want to talk primarily not about climate change, sorry. I want to take your minds back a few years to when the big issue, certainly one I had to deal with, was genetically modified foods. And do you remember the attack on Rothamsted Research Centre when Greenpeace activists went there and trashed the research centres? But do you remember they dressed up in hazmat suits and wore gas masks? And yet, of course, the effects, if there were any, of genetically modified foods had nothing to do with anything that might be absorbed, skin or breath. I actually, in this very room, heard the so-called chief scientist of Greenpeace, now there's an oxymoron if ever there were one, say that there was no distinction between the scientific method and beliefs that others might have. Like, for example, they promoted the idea that there was something special about radioactivity that came from nuclear power plants rather than natural radioactivity. And so I find the nature of the institutions that are promoting this science activity extremely... I'll just give you one example.
Finally, if you could just... so we can get back to the panel. Yep.
From one example from climate change, my research institute, when I was at Cambridge, was asked by then DOE to research adaptation to climate change in Britain and what might need to be done. We were attacked and we were told, why are you researching adaptation? You're reducing the likelihood of actual emissions reductions by studying adaptation. And I'm absolutely with Mark. I think that the institutions are extremely dangerous and need to be watched very carefully.
Right, okay, we've got some good divergence of view, and then we can just keep the temperature at a level, that'd be great. I think that would be, just what I took from that round. We've had a little bit about credibility of institutions. I think the point about, actually, are we arguing in some senses about two different things here? Recognise there are multiple roles for scientists in the system. It's actually when those two things conflate that actually the issues are there. What about institutional anti-activism, where people are against that? And is there an element of sometimes scientists? That last question I would just interpret as is an element of scientists using science in a disingenuous way in order to create a point or a position around something, like the example with genetically modified foods. So, Mark, I'm going to start with you this time at this end of the table to give your reflections on that, as they say in the civil service, rich set of questions.
Yes, indeed. So, firstly, I agree that scientists are, on the whole, credible messengers, but they're more credible on some topics than others. And a topic that I'm passionate about is actually vaccines, which couldn't be more important. But the reality is that we have a remarkably poor uptake of vaccines, and we're seeing the consequences of that. So scientists are very credible on the Higgs boson or on the latest astronomical discovery, or indeed on the latest piece of ecological discovery. So this is topic-based. And the question is, why aren't voters voting for the sort of policies one wants? And I just think it's wrong to think that the policy decisions here are easy. They're really, really difficult. And actually balancing intergenerational questions is not easy because the voters tend to vote against. And actually, I'm very much with you, Charles, on this question of crypto advocacy. But I think that if you have to wear a badge saying you're a scientist, I think there's something wrong, I'm afraid.
Abby.
Okay. Yeah, it's hard to know where to start. But one theme from both you and I think was it Ros over there was about scientists as credible messengers. I would also agree with that, and I've read the research that you mentioned. I really want to push back on the idea that we use our scientist identity as activists to imply some sort of sense of superiority, because I personally don't feel that. I'm pretty sure that Jeff doesn't either. I've never seen that in our community, really. The reason that we're labelling ourselves as scientists, and for the record, we do see people turn up to protest with grandmother, with teacher, with doctor, with all of those labels. We're not labelling ourselves because we think we're better. We're standing by our scientific identities to try and dispel the myths about who cares and who's taking action. The first time I ever got involved in a protest, I heard things like, oh, you joined a bunch of crusty hippies. It disrupted people's ideas of who protests, who cares, who's invested in a livable future. So I don't see it as superiority. I see it as a responsibility. We have that trust, rightly or wrongly, given to us as scientists, and I think that that means we have a responsibility to use it, not to quote Spider-Man too much or too indirectly. But yeah, I'd like to flip that idea on its head completely, that this could be an extension of the public responsibility of scientists, is to be vocal, active, brave.
I think Spider-Man's a wonderful source of
inspiration.
Of inspiration. Jeff.
Yeah, I'd like to pick up on that, and also the first question about the credibility of scientists, the fact that people care about these issues, and scientists represent a source of value, valuable information to them. Like Abby, I did want to address the point that Mark raised about scientists being superior in this context. It's not been my experience. When I have been in a rally or a march with other people, my first reaction of what I was there was a citizen. I had a real sense that I was with people who had a concern which I shared, and that I was being a citizen. They asked me to wear a white lab coat. They asked me to wear a white lab coat because it was an indication that they were backed by, supported by scientists who had information which would be useful in the arguments they wanted to make, and also that we were trusted individuals in society. The same reason why very often we are there with our colleagues in scrubs from health groups. We're asked to be that way because we are providing scientific and health expertise as trusted people in society to those many, many more people around with whom we are acting in that movement as citizens. So it isn't about superiority in my experience at all. And as Abby says, there are badges for teachers. There are badges for all kinds of people. We want to tell people where we come from, what our skills are in that.
Okay, can I move on, keep it going, unless you've got another point that you really want to make?
Well, just one very small point. Very small point. Mark, I appreciate your saying that we have failed to address climate change. But you are also saying, I believe, that this is a failure of activism. And I don't believe that's necessarily a failure of activism, because it's a failure of many other things as well. And activism is an attempt to accelerate response and to increase response. So I can't really associate this.
I'm going to allow the right to reply, I think.
Yeah, no, no. I'm not saying it's a sole failure of activism. What I am saying is that actually this is an incredibly difficult issue for politicians to tackle. Sure. And therefore, the challenge is actually to understand the political process better, to actually get involved much more energetically in real politics, if I can put it that way. And to recognize actually that not all activism is so popular with the public. So, you know, closing a motorway, pouring paint on things, gluing yourself to pictures in the National Gallery. These, I think, do not enhance the public view of activism. And so, yes, protest, yes, political activism. But when it goes beyond that, I think you need to look very, very carefully. We were given a somewhat dewy-eyed view of a more aggressive form of activism at the beginning of the session. And actually, I think you need to examine the evidence on what that does rather carefully.
Can I just respond to that quickly by asking you, what is your evidence that it doesn't?
Well, I think you just, where are the votes? At the end of the day, if you want to make a difference, you need to get votes.
So I'm going to call that. I mean, from my own experience, I'm trying to stay neutral in this as the chair, but I can attest, as somebody who was in government at the time, people were gluing themselves to the M25, that it wasn't widely received as a good idea by the politicians in that era. I report that.
Like to be effective.
I'm only reporting that as a factual statement. I make no judgment on that. I'm going to come and get some more questions though, because now my goodness, we're now hotting up. I'll go to Ed, who I promised, and the lady in white next, I think, and the lady in black, and the gentleman there. I see one at the back. We'll try and squeeze it all in because this is probably one of the last rounds. Ed.
Good. Ed Hill, former director of the National Oceanography Centre. I'd like to hear the panel's views on two ways in which activism can be seriously counterproductive, and therefore scientists run a risk of really getting tarnished by becoming associated with it. One is around mass disruption, which is of an indiscriminate nature, where we've seen on our TV screens real distress being caused to vulnerable individuals. And I noticed that Extinction Rebellion, in its 20 to 23-week quit statement, has rowed back from some of that, but other groups haven't. And secondly, which is also counterproductive and potentially alienating, is the way that climate activism becomes linked, concatenated with other issues. For example, pro-Palestinian, anti-Israel, e.g. Greta Thunberg, and therefore you end up with a series of linked issues underpinned by a political ideology, but which can be alienating for some of the people that you're trying to influence.
Right, super. Let's carry on. I think there's a lady in white, I think I promised, next on the right-hand side here.
Hello, my name's Juliet. First of all, an observation, it's been touched on already, but actually, Mark, I actually have a whole section of my wardrobe with different labels on clothes because I am a geographer, I'm a teacher, I'm a mother. Different label comes out at different protests. But because I think it is just to show that we're all valid. All scientists should be doing what they can. As a teacher, it's about safeguarding for me. That's why I would protest. My job is safeguarding, and therefore I would do activism too. But I wanted to ask about something I don't think anyone's touched on yet. I actually feel at the moment that we're not being effective as activists, and maybe you're not as scientists either because of the media. It's not just lobbyists.
Okay, that's a really good. We could go on for hours here, couldn't we? Lady in the black at the front, and then gentleman behind it. I have got the lady with the green top at the back as well. Thank you.
My question kind of builds on that, but it's more of a bridge building question, solution sort of thing. This may already be happening, but I work in comms. I've worked in comms for the environment sector and other things. So I have a sort of vested interest there, but now I'm working for the FST, so I'm technically neutral. But I just wondered if there was going to be an angle from the activism side for more sort of solutions-based research, and whether that might land better with policymakers and the public. And I don't know, that might already be happening. Just from a comms perspective, when I was in a press office working for researchers who were doing work on this area, I found that there was a lot of apathy or disinterest from the media in kind of, they felt that it was always kind of negative stuff or stuff that was just talking about the problem. And I'm sure that's something that has already been discussed, but I just wondered if the panel could talk to that.
That's really so solution-oriented. I've got another one online here. If activism is irresponsible, what other options do scientists have to impact policies? That solution space that we're looking again for as well. Gentleman behind with the blue shirt. Lady in green at the back, and that's it. And we'll come back to the panel for some final reflections.
Thank you. My name is Ehsan Massoud. I'm a science journalist and an editor at Nature. One sort of small comment and then one question. The comment really is that science activism isn't new. There's an extremely long history. There's a great literature around it. And I feel like a lot of this discussion is quite ahistorical. You know, we're not really talking about Shell and the Agoni, the Brent Spar, the Chipko movement in India. I mean, you know, you could go long before. I've been in this business for 30 years. People who've been here much longer than me have a lot more experience of reporting the relationship between science and campaigns and activism. But I guess the question that I want to pose to the panel, to all of you, and I guess in some ways it comes back, Mark, from what you were saying, which is that, you know, we are in a period, a political period, where we are electing more populist governments. And it may well be possible that in the next 3 years, 4 years, we will elect a government that is much less amenable to the kinds of things that all of us practice, regardless of what side of the argument we're on. You know, we believe in evidence and peer review and the consensus of expertise and trust. And if we start electing people who don't believe that, and they start changing the laws that we rely on to do the kinds of things that we want, to be able to protest or to publish in journals like mine, how are we going to respond?
Excellent. Final question from the lady with the green top at the back there.
Thank you very much for fitting me in. My name's Harriet and I host the Lab Matters podcast. If you don't have it in your download list, then you know what to do. Just one point I'd like to make about why it would be really good to have more scientists and science-adjacent people as politicians. It's because, as politicians, you have to accept a lack of definitiveness in society. And I think as researchers, as scientists and science-adjacent, there's a widespread acceptance of the fact that you have to keep moving, keep analysing, keep asking. And curiosity is, I think, more important than confidence in a lot of ways. So the question, to Mark's point earlier about the trade-offs between now and the future, I wondered if the panellists had any examples of costs that they would deem to be acceptable when it comes to protecting the future at the cost of the present.
Okay, super. Like, so very, again, interesting round. Is activism counterproductive in the mass disruption and alienation sort of question? Really somebody bringing out the question of what is the role of the media in this? You know, maybe we're aiming at the wrong people for this. Can we have more solutions rather than problems? What is the solutions part of that? How are we going to influence populist governments, many of whom have indicated they would have very strong anti-climate positions? And how do we get more scientists and politicians drive that curiosity? Some reflections on that. It is, I think, Jeff, your turn to start.
Okay, thank you. There's been quite a lot of comments, including some of the most recent ones, about scientists, about activism which is misusing science, which is distorting science, you know, wearing hazmat suits when you're out dealing with genetically modified crops. There is bad science in activism on all sides. I think one of the feelings that we have is that we must, as scientists, make sure that doesn't happen. Not only challenge the science deniers, but also make sure that the science of people who are supporting action is honest and accurate. And I think, you know, going back to Charles's point of we can be impartial providers of information for policymakers, we can be activists in advocating a particular solution to a problem. But the science has got to be the same. It's got to be the same for both of those. We can't allow the distortion of science for political purposes, whatever the campaign is. And I think that's something that drives a lot of us as scientists who have become activists, the need to bring accurate science and to engage people and help them use accurate science in their protest movements.
Abby.
I'd like to respond to the comments about the distress caused by activism and activists, and particularly disruptive actions, and contrast that with the incredibly real distress of living in a world which is not acting on reality. It's not facing up to facts. Can you imagine what it would be like to be growing up in a society where you could expect not to be able to have access to clean water and food in your lifetime? We've had 3 of the worst harvests on record in recent years, and the trajectory is only getting worse. I'm in a position in my 30s where I don't expect to be able to claim a pension or to be able to do any of those things that were kind of set out in that path of my life because of inaction. And that causes me daily distress. And I dread to think what it causes people less privileged than me, who have less access to powerful people than I do. So I think about every single student I've ever seen crying in the lab because they're scared of the world that they're entering. I think about every young activist who's ever asked me a science question they actually know the answer to better than the people they're trying to advocate to. So I feel like it's just such a false comparison to compare the minor disruption that disruptive activism does to the incredibly real, imminent, current distress that many people around the world are feeling from the physical impacts of the climate and ecological emergency, but the psychological aspects and the grief of the loss of a future for so many billions of people around the world.
Thank you. Mark.
So Abby, I'm very sympathetic to what you say, but I live in a world where evidence is all important. And the evidence is that governments around the world are not acting in the way you would like. That's the reality. And the question is, what is the best way to change that? We are fortunate because we live in a democracy, and the thing that would change it would be votes. And that is the big challenge. And so, to me, labels don't actually matter that much. It's votes that matter. And all the evidence is that democratic societies are choosing populist leaders who are going in exactly the wrong direction. And you've only got to look across the Atlantic to see the effects of that. And so this is the real world. Now, blaming the media for this I don't think is appropriate either, because actually there's some extraordinarily good science media, and I would have talked about the Science Media Centre if I'd had a bit more time. So you can pick your media. It's like everything else. I mean, there's nothing new in this. People choose the media that they want to read because it sort of resonates with them. And like it or not, I think there is a balance that politicians are treading between the interests of the old and the present and the interests of the young and the future. And you can see that in all sorts of aspects of government policy at the moment where young people are losing out, whether it's student debt, whether it's access to housing, when it's the length of time that people will need to work before they get their pensions. Again and again, I'm afraid I think that my generation votes against the interests of younger people. And so the reality is, yes, activism is fine, as long as it's responsible. And I do not think it is responsible activism to disrupt society, mainly because I think it rebounds against you. So activism by protest, activism by political involvement, those are all really important. But I think you need to look very carefully at the more extreme manifestations of that. I think about the point about the sort of correlation with other forms of activism, probably true to some extent, but I don't think that's the fundamental issue. And the reality is that, like it or not, this is a really, really hard decision. It does matter. And I think there is room for activism. I think there is room for the sort of advice that Jim provides in his role in the IPCC, where the actual nature of the evidence is really important. Nothing is quite as cut and dried as is sometimes presented. So we do face a difficult future, and it's not just climate, it's pollution of every sort, actually. It's hard to look at the world and think that I'm afraid Thomas Malthus was probably right. But that's maybe not a happy note to end on, but that's where I end.
So, wonderful. Thank you very much to all our panellists. I don't really know how to summarise this session in many respects. But I think that is in some respects the conclusion. There isn't a conclusion to this. What we've heard tonight is arguments for the role that scientific activism can play. We've heard other arguments about how that might play out in different contexts. I'm very much left with the thought, having chaired this panel and listened to both sides of it, a lot of this is contextual. You know, if you want to influence policy with evidence, there are ways of doing that. Activism may have a role to play in different elements of that, and we should respect each other and each other's views for that, but recognise that we probably have a divergent view on how to achieve the same outcomes. I think the challenge of urgency has come across quite clearly in the panel, and the challenge of generational fairness as well has come out quite a lot in this as well. I think we realise that science is in one level special in the way that it can help form and inform policy, but at the same time doesn't give scientists a special position. And I think I'm getting very used to now, actually, in my experience, holding two actually utterly opposing ideas simultaneously in my head. I've become quantized, I think, in this, because actually to move forward on many of these issues, you have to be able to hold a degree of discordancy, I think. And maybe that is my final conclusion tonight, that we end up with a degree of agreement in discordancy actually as the way forward, and recognise that there are multiple pathways to achieve the same outcomes. As somebody once said, there is more than one way to skin a cat. I have personally never skinned that cat. So with that final thought, I just want to say thank you again to the panels. To Charlie Gardner, thank you for a wonderful presentation, but couldn't be here tonight. Abby Perrin, Jeff Wodge and Mark Walport. You will receive a survey following this event, and we'd really appreciate your feedback. There will be a recording of this event on the Foundation's website tomorrow, so should you want to relive this whole experience, you may do that. If you want to recommend it to your friends, please do. Our next event will be on the 29th of April and is entitled UK Space Policy and Supporting UK Space Industry Past, Present and Future. Details and registration are online. For those that have joined us online, thank you for your questions. Thank you and good night. For those of you in the room, there are drinks to outside, and I am sure the debate will continue for quite a while to come. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much, Jeff.